In a world which often seems to be on the brink of some kind of undisclosed apocalypse, it often seems like the future of humankind is underground, retreating to tunnels and caves and shelters to escape natural disasters, asteroid strikes, or even nuclear annihilation is a commonly seen trope in today's mass media. But believe it or not, there are already many people who have been forced to seek out their dwellings in the recesses of society. These are mole people, the world's homeless, stuck with no alternative but to live in the inhospitable conditions of abandoned tunnels and sewers. You've probably heard stories about them, that they eat dead rats and human flesh, that they've adapted to being able to see in the dark, and that they have their own tribe-like cities and cultures, and have children who never see the light of day. But none of this is true. In fact, the mole people are just ordinary people who fell on hard times and are trying to find somewhere to keep themselves safe. At the moment, homelessness is becoming a larger and larger problem, with homeless people having attention drawn to them in many countries around the world. But despite appearances in the media and some heartwarming stories of homeless folk who have had some special talent and got noticed and rescued from debilitating poverty, this just isn't the case for the vast majority of people living rough, having fallen on hard times and losing everything, barely making enough money to eat. It's not surprising that many seek the underground for shelter. The most famous group of mole people around are the inhabitants of the Riverside Park Tunnel in New York City. A few dozen denizens whose lives were revealed to the rest of the world in 1990 when the New York Times ran an article about their plight. That being that Amtrak, the US's major rail service, were trying to evict them from the derelict tunnel so that they could get the line running again. New York is no stranger to homelessness, or the ingenuity of those having to do anything to survive. Of course, in 1929, the stock market crashed, the catalyst igniting the crucible of the Great Depression, one of the biggest periods of destitution and extreme poverty in a so-called first world country in the 20th century. Millions of people unemployed and unable to live, they built Hoovervilles, a dark pun on the name of President Herbert Hoover, whose do-nothing political policies were a contributing factor to the Depression in the first place. Built in Central Park, this shantytown was often known as an eyesore, albeit a well-documented eyesore which was home to hundreds, if not thousands, of people when the Depression peaked in 1933. But the Riverside Park Tunnel, sometimes nicknamed the Freedom Tunnel, is a different matter entirely. While the people who made it their home built makeshift furniture out of whatever they could find, saved many treasured possessions, scavenged for food and things to sell to make money, the difference is that the mole people are invisible. They don't reside in the center of New York's most famous landmarks, but instead in a decrepit and disused railway tunnel that most people are too scared to explore. People hardly even knew they were there until the aforementioned 1990 news article, which was pretty much the way they liked it. Despite being without a home legally, many of the tunnel dwellers did not, and still don't, consider themselves homeless. The Freedom Tunnel offers a safe refuge for many of the down-and-out populace of New York, especially when compared with homeless shelters and other solutions that they're pushed toward. These shelters, most notably one called Freedom House on West 95th Street, are notable for having appalling conditions. Freedom House in particular is frequently raided by the police. It's filthy, full of drug dealers and drug addicts, and the private company who run it just don't seem to care. In 2017, the company were asked to leave by the city so that new management could be found, but it's currently unclear whether conditions will improve with this recent change. By contrast, the Riverside Park Tunnel becomes superior accommodation for many people. 30 years ago, it was quiet, calm, and safe. Many people were just too scared to enter the tunnel, meaning that dwellers inside were often left alone by outsiders in the place, allowing them to live relatively peaceful and secluded lives while protected from the elements. Some areas of the tunnels even have rules, like that you have to be quiet so as not to disturb other residents and not to draw the attention of the Amtrak police. You're not allowed to steal from other residents. You have to respect people's privacy. A few decades ago, one man called Brendan Isaac even became an unofficial spokesperson of the tunnel and its residents, once declaring himself the Lord of the Tunnel. He was the one who talked to journalists and organizations seeking to illuminate the lives of the mole people, and possibly even help them to rejoin society. One tunnel resident, called John Kovacs, had been living down there for 16 years by the time 1991 came around, and was offered a $50,000 deal from Hollywood for the rights to his story, so that they could make a film about him. The film deal didn't go well, and only 7 months after leaving, Kovacs had returned. But many people living down there actually enjoy the isolation and sanctity of the tunnel compared with the hustle and bustle of New York life above. They're incredibly adaptable, and prove that humankind's survival instinct can kick in at any time. In 1990, there were roughly 100 people living in about a mile stretch inside the tunnel, hidden in alcoves and on catwalks and in old buildings abandoned by Amtrak. Some even building their shanty huts right in the middle of the tunnel. People speaking with the media at this time said they don't like having people there who do drugs or who panhandle. The tunnel dwellers go to work, with some of them having real jobs in places like McDonald's, and try to provide for themselves and the families a few of them have. Despite the various attempts at evicting the Freedom's tunnel populace, and the train lines being reactivated, there are still a few dozen people who call it their home and hide in the nooks and crannies so they're not forced to leave and find somewhere more dangerous to live. While the dwellers of Riverside Park Tunnel are the most famous real-life mole people out there, though they do frequently visit the surface in order to wash themselves and their clothes and try and do an honest day's work, they're not the only society of this kind, and they're certainly not the smallest. In the 90s, Freedom Tunnel was being evicted, but elsewhere in America, a different underground construction was just beginning. In Las Vegas, the city planned to build over 1,000 miles of storm drains to protect the arid city from the flash floods and monsoon-like rains it sometimes suffers, to keep it a viable tourist destination all year round. Just like New York's derelict train tunnels, these storm drains of Vegas have also become home to a booming population of the downtrodden. There's estimated to be between 1,000 and 1,500 people squatting down there, putting them in a dangerous situation when the rains inevitably do come, as flooding happens frequently and often washes people's belongings away. Many people down on their luck travel to Vegas hoping to turn everything around in the adult playground of the neon casinos, but it rarely happens this way, and they end up starving and struggling and staying out of sight of Vegas's millions of partying tourists. All of these mole people, wherever they crop up, are just ordinary people who sometimes made a few bad choices and sometimes were plain unlucky. They're not the cannibalistic mutant monsters of popular culture. One resident even said that the only things they don't have down there are running water and electricity, though other residents have been known to create complicated rigs to siphon electricity from nearby establishments. Today, the tunnels in New York are shadows of what they once were, with Amtrak's efforts to clean them up being largely successful, though it's still thought that a fair few, especially artful dwellers, are still hiding beneath the surface.